Okay, sorry it's taking me till Sunday here to get this up, but we were talking about flight and birds and about where the feathers are and where the lift and the thrust comes from. These are the kind of physical forces that are at play when we're talking about flight. And so we said that these feathers at the end of their wing, these are called the primaries, are the ones that provide the thrust, and then the secondary are the ones that provide the lift. Okay, and so let's see, if we look, the secondary feathers are attached along the ulna, and then the primaries are actually attached to what would be our hand and finger bones. Okay, so if you look at how different birds' wings are shaped, you can kind of guess what they're designed for. Right, so we said that primaries are attached here on the phalanges and metacarpals, and that the secondary feathers are attached here along the ulna. So a wing that's shaped like this would be much better for thrust than this one, and a wing that has a long ulnar length and therefore a lot of surface area for feather attachment would be very good for lift. So this, I believe this one on the top, these come out of your book, but I've got the book here, but I believe the one on the top is a ruby-throated hummingbird, which makes sense because they really have to produce a lot of thrust, and that's kind of what keeps them in the air, able to fly up and down and back and side to side. And I'm pretty sure the one on the bottom is one of the extremes for lift, and that would be the albatross. Okay, so the shape of the wing is related to the ecology of the bird, the behavior of the bird, basically the bird's niche and lifestyle. So biologists put wings into these four main kind of classes or categories, depending on that ratio of lift to thrust, or secondary feathers to primary feathers. And these are the four categories. We've got A is dynamic soaring. So we see very high lift ability or generation. The pheasant is sort of on the other end of the extreme. Well, I guess not on the total end of the extreme, but more and larger primaries. So definitely this bird is, for example, a pheasant, something like that. That's a woodland bird that lives on the ground and needs to be able to lift off the ground very quickly. So in other words, it has a very high amount of thrust. And the C, high aspect ratio, to me it's difficult to kind of see the difference between A and C, except I guess ratio wise there's a lot more thrust than there is lift. So if we look at how many primary feathers relative to the length of the wing, then there's a lot of thrust. These are very fast moving flying birds like swallows, falcons, and then finally D is the high aspect ratio, or no, I'm sorry, that's the high lift. Okay, and so these are for soaring birds like hawks and vultures, things like that. They do have, compared to the elliptical wings, they have more lift, but still a decent amount of thrust too. So see some examples here. This will be the dynamic soaring wings. This will be the elliptical. No, these are the elliptical wings. This is a bobwhite quail. Again, woodland bird that lives on the forest floor, high lift, and then the, what are these called? High aspect ratio? Yeah, see. So, again, what does the bird do? How does it make its living? And that's going to really determine the shape of their wings. Okay, wing loading is another variable that you can discuss when you're looking at birds. And this is basically talking about it's a ratio of the mass of the bird over the area of the wings. Okay, and we see that there's some of these birds, like a mute swan, very big birds, heavy birds, and again, most of the time they're spending on the water. Golden eagles, relatively low wing loading. Again, they're spend most of their time soaring around. Hummingbirds, while it's a lot lower than the mute swan, it's a lot higher than things like a barn swallow, which are, you know, somewhat similar size. So, wing loading. Adaptations for flight. So, streamlined body. So that, again, looking at their feathers, how they interlock and create a very smooth contour, smooth surface. The bones of birds, if you find a bone in the woods and it's hollow, that's probably a bird bone. Although interestingly, so I figured that they would be a lot lighter weight than mammals. But in the book it says that the skeleton of a bird is not really any lighter. It's just sort of changing the distribution of where the weight is. But it's also the hollow bones can serve as pockets for gas sacs. So they basically, birds have this strange respiratory system, and I'll show that on the next slide. But suffice to say, that's related to these pneumatic bones. Okay, so you probably remember this from General Zoo if you took it last year. But think about how we breathe in. It's oxygen-rich air. As we breathe out, it's getting rid of the CO2. So really, we are only gaining oxygen on the inspiration, not on the expiration. But with birds, as they breathe in, some of the air goes into the lungs, some of it goes into these air sacs, again, that can be found in the large bones of the body. As the bird expires or breathes out, it's forcing the air from the air sacs into the lungs. Okay, so both as they're breathing in and as they're breathing out, fresh oxygenated air is moving over the lungs for absorption. So almost, think about more or less twice as much oxygen. Lots of energy required for flight, and all these huge muscle mass that are associated with flight. So birds have very rapid digestion. They have a crop, which is basically an enlarged portion of the esophagus where food can be stored. So even if the bird is not flying or scavenging, or maybe not even if it doesn't even have to be awake, the body can be taking food out of the crop and then feeding it back into its two-chambered stomach. Stomach is basically, first chamber is chemical digestion, and then the second chamber is more mechanical. So the proventriculus produces enzymes and acid, and then the gizzard smashes up that food with the enzymes and acid and accomplishes mechanical digestion. So it's basically like chewing, and a lot of times birds will swallow rocks. I don't know if you've ever had chickens. They have to have a little poultry grit. And then the intestine, right? There's that ceca, which is good for holding bacteria that are helpful in digesting plant material, right? There are very few, if any, animals that have the enzymes that are able to break down cellulose. So oftentimes have to rely on symbiotic bacteria to do that. And then the cloaca, this is again the common excretory reproductive opening. Similar, I guess, maybe homologous to the colon, or last part of the large intestine in mammals. Birds often have very good vision. Many birds cannot see very well in low light conditions, but then there are some that can see very well. Hearing, very acute hearing, but only birds that are ground nesters or particularly carrion eaters like turkey vultures or black vultures have really almost any sense of smell at all. Very poor olfactory senses. Vision, very strange setup. They have these huge eyes, which are good for gathering images and for gathering light. The brain, because of those huge eyes, is actually displaced relative to the brain in mammals. The eyes can be flattened to tubular. Birds with very big eyes have these tubular eyes that allow them to fit the eye inside of the skull. Like we see in 3 chroma, or 3 ranges of the visible light, birds have tetrachromatic vision, and their 4th, in some birds, see very high up on the blue spectrum, and then there's mutations in other groups of birds where that chroma that is useful for seeing very deep blues has shifted up into the ultraviolet range. Right? So some birds are able to see in UV. Okay, so this shows again, these huge eyes, tubular eyes that are able to fit into the skull properly. We'll see this structure here called a pecten, and it's not quite certain what it does, but it's probably associated with, well, it's definitely vascular, so there's a lot of capillaries in this structure, and that's probably involved with providing nutrients to the eye, particularly the lens, I think, in the cornea. So yeah, very unique eyes. And this is how they see the world, right? So on the left, this is what we would see when we look, was parakeet or cockatoo or something, and at the egg. And then if you look in the middle, it's just UV. And then with bird view, with those 4 chroma, the tetrachromatic vision that sees the deep blues, and some of the feathers would appear totally different colors particularly because of the UV sensitivity. So maybe able to recognize individual birds more easily, like say birds like this that nest in big colonies and they have to fly out, come back, find their specific mate, find their offspring. It may be useful for that. Maybe make eggs more clearly visible to birds without making them more visible to predators. So several hypotheses about why birds have evolved ultraviolet vision, why that's adaptive. Hearing, similar to other vertebrates. Of course, you don't see the ear opening in birds because they're covered with feathers, but they have a very large, basically like a drum, well, tympanic membrane. I believe tympanic membrane is what goes over the eardrum, and so very acute hearing in birds, which is not surprising considering they are auditory communicators. Check out this skull of a, what is this, pygmy owl? But it doesn't matter. Most owls have the same type of adaptation. That's basically allows them to hear in more than stereo and be able to gain more information from information coming in the two different ears. It allows them to basically triangulate and to find food that they can hear. Yes, birds. Most birds live in groups. Even if they don't, they still have to find a mate. Will maintain a territory, and a lot of singing, and is just a display at the edge of the territory. Extensive courtship, right? That offers the opportunity for sexual selection to be a very important form of evolution in birds. Parental investment. Normally, birds are very good parents. They're going to sit on the nest, maybe pluck out a little patch of feathers so that they can transfer their warmth right to those little baby eggs. Some of them will roll the eggs. They may pick out dead eggs and carry them away. Once the babies hatch, they actually take the fecal matter of the little baby and carry it out and drop it away from the nest so it doesn't attract predators. I mean, they're very good parents, so that's quite different than other reptile type of organisms. And many show these really long migrations. Here's a male northern cardinal and female checking out his courtship dance. See if he's up to snuff and worth her eggs. Classic evidence for sexual selection here. Go out into the jungles of India and find a peafowl and find her little babies. Check the parentage of all the little babies, and you'll see that if you know all the males, that the male that has the highest number of eye spots in his tail feathers is also the one that has acquired more mates than others, and very likely they'll have a lot more chicks out there with his genes. So, and that's the point, right? The more eyes, the more sexy, the more babies begets more eyes, and so on and so forth. And that's evolution, right? By sexual selection. Yeah, so these birds have flown across the entire Gulf of Mexico here this fall, right? Some will travel from up in Canada all the way down to the Yucatan and in Central America. Pretty remarkable for a tiny, tiny little bird like that. About 10,000 extant or living species of birds. Estimates I've read say there's maybe twice that number in actuality. Birds have been around since the Jurassic period, so we're alive with many of their contemporary dinosaur kin. Found everywhere. Well, it makes sense because they're very good at dispersing. So something like a lungless salamander you don't find in Africa, you don't find in Australia. Why? Because they're not very good at flying and or swimming across saltwater. Birds, right, disperse easily. Birds fly from one end of the globe to the other. These are just, I mean, this goes along with what's in the lab, for the lab practical, the second one. But I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly. Gaviiformes. This is the loons. This is the loon nest. She builds it in the water, but near the shallow water, near the land. Here's a little baby loon chick. Podicipediformes. These are the grebes. We have that is not a pipe-bill grebe, is it? That's another type of grebe. Pelecaniformes. We have the cormorant and the lab practical. These are basically marine, large rivers, lakes, but a lot of them are on the coast. Colonial nesters. There's a frigate bird. There's a booby. This is a cormorant, and that is, of course, pelican. Shoot. Well. Okay. Oh, there it is. Ciconia-formes, the herons, storks, ibises, spoonbills, mostly all water birds. Here's our great blue and our green heron. And seriformes, all the waterfowl. We've got wood duck, bufflehead, Canada geese, and mallard, falconiformes. This includes the vultures, but also the hawks that you guys need to know. We've got red-tailed hawk, the turkey vulture, American kestrel. You guys can read through these. I'm not going to waste your time. So that's sort of the second part of the birds lecture tomorrow. Monday we will talk about mammals, and then the second exam is on Wednesday. All right, thanks, folks.